One interesting and cool thing that will happen in Season 3 is the continuation of what we have gotten throughout this season, which was the perhaps initially controversial choice of Blizzard to gate the new expansion dungeons in order for, rebooting and updating some of the older dungeons into the Mythic Plus pool. Some of the players were quite angry because I paid full price for this expansion and I want all of the content available from day one, but Blizzard had a different idea. What if what we used to keep the seasons of Mythic Plus fresh, which was the affix of the season, like encrypted or prideful or tormented, what if we get rid of the affix of the season and instead we start cycling dungeons every season? So that's what's gonna keep the season fresh every time. New dungeons to try. Now you're not stuck anymore trying to do the same dungeon for like 2 years in a row, right? Like for example in Shadowlands, day 1 you are doing Necrotic Wake, day 700 of Shadowlands you're still doing Necrotic Wake in Mythic Plus, right? So in Season 1 we have gotten 4 dungeons of Dragonflight and 4 old dungeons, and then in Season 2 we have gotten the other 4 dungeons of Dragonflight and 4 more old dungeons. So what's gonna happen in Season 3? Now that we are out of Dragonflight dungeons to test for the first time in Mythic Plus? Well, we know, first of all, that we are getting 10 dungeons in Season 3 instead of 8 dungeons because we are getting the Mega Dungeon. We are getting the Dawn of the Infinite split into 2 wings, just like we have gotten all of the previous Mega Dungeons turned into Mythic Plus keys, like Tazavesh, like Mechagon, and like Karazhan. So that's the first new thing. Then we also have the initial intention, which we can assume is staying that way, of Blizzard to make up the 4 favorite dungeons of the Dragonflight pool and bring them in Season 3. So for example, we can assume a dungeon like Uldaman or a dungeon like Halls of Infusion are not gonna make the cut in Season 3, for example, while maybe a dungeon like Ruby Life Pools, maybe a dungeon like Brackenide Hollow might make the cut for Season 3. But what's more interesting and what's more cool to think about is trying to see, for example, based on your preferences, what are going to be, or maybe what should be, the dungeons chosen by Blizzard from the older expansions to be put into the Mythic Plus pool in Season 3. Now, we can of course ignore the dungeons from Shadowlands, as it was the last expansion, and I'm pretty sure Blizzard is not going to revamp a dungeon that is just a few months old. So before Shadowlands we have a whole possible pool of dungeons available. We have to of course first remove all of the dungeons that we have gotten recently, that were updated recently for the last few seasons of Mythic Plus, as it's likely they're not going to be brought back again. We can then also remove some of the meme dungeons. Some of the dungeons, it's very unlikely they will be making a comeback, like the Oculus, like the Violet Hold, like the, I guess, other version of the Violet Hold. Also some, old entry-level dungeons, even though it could be quite cute, quite fun to see them being reinvented as a Mythic Plus dungeon, like Black Fathom Deep, like the Dead Mines, like Nomerigan, the 2 Rutherford dungeons likely also, or something like Ragefire Chasm. It's unlikely they will be making the cut. Here is our friend Wailing Caverns, another entry-level dungeon. These are unlikely to make the cut into a Mythic Plus version. Also the Black Morass, a completely plain empty swamp, it's unlikely will be turned into a Mythic Plus key. Those are just very, very unlikely to be ever made into a Mythic Plus version. So now we have still a pretty large number of dungeons to our disposal. I think what could be the more difficult one to adapt are the Burning Crusade dungeons, because they are, quite of an old style of splitting the same very large dungeon into 3 different smaller versions, which make the runs quite short. For example, a dungeon like Mana Tombs, a dungeon like Setek Halls become quite difficult to be turned into a key. Same goes for the Alphi Ramparts, which is like a 10-minute dungeon. It's quite difficult to imagine it turned, or even the Blood Furnace, quite difficult to imagine it being turned into a significant Mythic Plus key. Now, their deads, their big boy versions, like the Shattered Halls, for example, or like the Shadow Labyrinth, now those could be turned into a bigger, larger Mythic Plus dungeon. That could make more sense. So for example, something like the Steam Vaults over something like the Slave Pens or the Underbog or something like Alcatraz, or even Mechana over something like the Botanica, which is easier and shorter. Those could make sense when it comes to TBC. I wouldn't be too certain dungeons that have been used way too many times already, like Zulaman, previous raid turned into dungeon, as well as Zul'Gurub, previous raid turned into dungeon, will make it as part of a Mythic Plus key. I am a fan, and also based on some inside sources, I think a dungeon like Dark Heart Thicket actually has a pretty good chance at becoming a Mythic Plus key next season, and as personal favorite, I would also shill for Waker's Manor. I think I liked that dungeon from BFA, even though we have gotten our fair share of BFA dungeons already, to be honest, because we have gotten already the Underrot and Freehold this season, for example, so we already have our fair share of BFA callbacks. I would still like a couple of BFA dungeons to make the list, since those were pretty cool. Talking about who even remembers that, I would cut something like the Halls of Reflection, or even something like the Halls of Lightning. Who even remembers these dungeons? Even the third brother of the Halls duo, the Halls of Origination, another one off in the bottom, because I don't even remember what they were, so let's keep them out. There are also some dungeons that are quite difficult to imagine as a Mythic Plus key, like the Old Hisbard Foothills, just the roleplay element of the entire dungeon would make it quite a hard Mythic Plus dungeon to put into effect. Same goes for something like the Hour of Twilight, or something like the Calling of Stratholme, talking about RP elements, just to avoid the PTSD for many players. I would put very little chance on Seat and Cathedral from Legion to be brought back as Mythic Plus keys. I think also Dire Maul as a vanilla dungeon is far too old and far too rusty to be brought back. Same goes for Zul'Farrak, another one of these old rusty dungeons. I only think the bigger and larger and more old school classic styles of dungeons from vanilla, like BRD, Blackrock Depths, or similar examples like Blackrock Spire, could reasonably be turned into a Mythic Plus dungeon. It would require some tuning, of course, otherwise the timer for the key would be 2.5 hours, but they are big, large, and imposing enough to make sense for a Mythic Plus key, even if they are like 20 years old dungeons. Someone that isn't shaped like a Mythic Plus dungeon is something like Sunken Temple, for example. Literally a circle with some small rooms. Doesn't really make for a Mythic Plus dungeon. Talking about not making it for a Mythic Plus dungeon, Scarlet Halls, I'm afraid, is also quite too small for being turned into a Mythic Plus dungeon. I think Scarlet Monastery could be amongst the short and quick versions of a Mythic Plus key. Maybe that could make sense. Same goes for something like the Magister's Terrace also. That is amongst the better ones from TBC in terms of layout for a Mythic Plus key. I have to go to one of my favorites once more. No real reason to point this out, because this would be quite a straightforward dungeon, since the options you have in the dungeons are very, very limited. Grimbat Hall. I just like the setting, the feeling of the dungeon, even though I'm quite sure it would make for quite the bad Mythic Plus dungeon, to be fair. So please forgive me if I put Grimbat Hall in one of my most wanted for Mythic Plus. Talking about Legion, please, for the love of God, don't bring us the Archway back. We've done enough with Court of Stars already. Also Karazhan, please, not again. We already gotten our version. Some players have been talking positively about the Legion dungeons, certainly not about Vault of the Wardens. Please, thanks very much. Also, I'm sorry to break your nostalgia, but Maw of Souls is not a good Mythic Plus key, okay? Take away your goggles. You did this because you farmed artifact power and fished for Titan Forging of the Trinket. It's not a good dungeon to have in Mythic Plus. Same goes for Forge of Souls, which I do like overall, but it's a very short dungeon. What's that, 2 bosses, 3 bosses? It's just too short of a dungeon to imagine being reworked into a Mythic Plus version. Also, to have some mercy on everyone's camera angles, please don't bring Toldagor back into the Mythic Plus pool. You have other more interesting and more fun dungeons from those times of BFA. Like we mentioned, Waker's Manor, but even something like the Motherlode is fine to have as a reboot over something like Tol Dagor, or something like Siege of Boralus, or something like Temple of Setulus, or God forbid Shrine of the Storm. Let's not have him back. King's Rest also, let's not have it back. Okay, fine, it has been fixed over time. It wasn't nearly as much of a disaster, but you know, let's just avoid having King's Rest again, please. Another fan favorite, Ataldazar. Pretty cool dungeon, pretty nice dungeon. I might even bump it up a little bit more as a fan favorite. Talking about fan favorites, I think Pit of Sauron is actually a pretty good dungeon, albeit also kind of quite too small. Eye of Ajara also is a pretty decent dungeon. A personal favorite is Blackrook Hold. I know some players don't like Blackrook Hold that much, I do though. And since the video is mine, that's where I'm putting Blackrook Hold. Everbloom also is kind of a decent idea for a comeback in Mythic Plus, not Skyreach, definitely not Bloodmoon Slogmines. Oakindon is a decent idea. Halls of Stone is another one of the Halls dungeons that nobody even remembers. Stormstart Brewery, it's a good addition to Mythic Plus. Siege of Nuza Temple is also a pretty good addition, and so is Shadowpan Monastery, which is one of my favorite dungeons from all the way back of Mists. Also Mogushan Palace is a pretty good addition, now that I think about it. Mists of Pandaria had some pretty decent dungeons, not you, and also not you, and also not you, but you, for example, are pretty good. You are not from Mists of Pandaria, but the Stonecore has been quite a, you know, fond dungeon, interesting dungeon to have. City of the Tolvir, not at all, End Times also not. Blackrock Caverns, I would say, also a pretty good one. Gondrak, not really. Stockade is a meme. Stratel, we have heard enough of you already. Ajol Nerub, together with Ankahet, mostly for the nostalgia of having some Nerubians back in the game, actually. You know, it wouldn't be too bad to have the Spider Grandpas making a comeback in Mythic Plus. Shadowfang Keep is definitely too short to be put into a dungeon. I forgot these ones as part of the memes of dungeons. And then UBRS, I guess this was lower and this is the upper part, still good enough to have into a Mythic Plus key. Skolo, we had too much of you already. Atgar Pinnacle and Atgar Keep, I think they are both okay. If I had to have my bias for my favorite one, I would say Keep above Pinnacle, to be honest. And then the Nexus, also a pretty liked overall dungeon back in Wrath. So looking at our choices, if we eliminate all of the bottom, there is a decent amount of dungeons I would not mind have turned into Mythic Plus keys for the next season. I guess I can finish with 4 of them because we will have 4 new ones. So if I had to make a call, I would say Dark Ticket and Ataldazar, and then Shadowpan Monastery. And I would actually promote my bias, which is Grim Batol from Cataclysm, even though the chances of Grim Batol making it into a Mythic Plus key are very, very short. I still will go with my heart on this one. This would be my preferred first set of Mythic Plus dungeons for Season 3, followed by Waker's Manor and the Motherlode, Blackrook Hold, Stonecore, Blackrock Caverns, and the Nexus. It's still a decent amount of dungeons I would be happy with, probably like 40% of the dungeons. If we exclude dungeons that we just physically cannot have, like all of these, because we've gotten them before, it is probably a 50-50. So knowing Blizzard, what's gonna happen is we will get 2 fan favorites. We will get like Dark Art Ticket and the Motherlode, for example, or Ataldazar and the Nexus. And then we're gonna get Shrine of the Storm and Vault of the Wardens as the other 2 choices, probably, knowing the thought process of Blizzard. However, this is, at least for me, my list of, you know, wanted favorite dungeons I would like to see in Season 3 be turned into a Mythic Plus key. Let me guys know, of course, what is your top 4, you know, top 8 maybe, your first 2 rows of dungeons you would like to see being added in Season 3 of Mythic Plus. Besides this, for today with this list, we are leaving each other on this Thursday. We are, of course, thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. You can still, of course, thank in plenty of other ways, like liking and commenting down below completely for free, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I know it. I know it's gonna happen. A couple of these dungeons lurking in here are gonna be picked by Blizzard to be a Mythic Plus dungeon next season.